Hello, my name is Sandy Gould, and this is my video presentation of my CHI 2024 paper, Stochastic Machine Witnesses at Work. I will forego the full title. What's this paper about then? The paper starts off by talking about the different ways of knowing in human-centered computing. There are a whole bunch of different epistemologies in human-centered computing research. There's a bunch of different papers talking about the ways that different research traditions construct knowledge in the discipline. And there's a kind of a loose mapping, if you like, to the concept of waves, first wave, third wave, etc., etc. In the paper, what I focus on is what I call the rarefying impulses of first wave cognitive science-inspired human-centered computing research and the reifying impulses of the UbiComp tradition. What do I mean by that? Well, in the first wave cognitive science tradition, you've got this attempt to abstraction, right? You try and make design studies that are controlled, that lock down the possibilities, try and distill. It's a kind of a form of knowledge production that attempts to distill something by controlling almost everything else. Again, this is not a critique of this. It's just an exploration of the ways of generating knowledge. And then the kind of UbiComp tradition is quite different. At least my take is that it's quite different. And you have this kind of reifying impulse, this attempt to measure reality as it exists, not to control, not to try and lock things down, not to isolate, not to abstract, but to try and say the world is messy. Are we able to observe it? And I think this is an interesting kind of it's not a tension, but a kind of interesting contrast between these different kinds of epistemologies and these kind of research traditions. And what I started to think about was the extent to which these kind of different these two kind of approaches to generating knowledge map to workplaces and trying to understand workplaces. There's a whole bunch of quite hardcore controlled experimental studies of workplaces. There's also a bunch of UbiComp work of trying to instrument and sense workplaces to try and develop knowledge or understanding about them. So that's the kind of the way the paper starts off, and then the question the paper asks is how did these rarefication and reification processes look at work? And the argument the paper makes is that if you were able to kind of combine this kind of ability to abstract, control, to pin down, along with this capacity to sense reality. Again, you may reject the premise here. Then you would have a significantly enhanced potential for surveillance. So, for example, the paper, the specific kind of case study the paper develops is VR workplaces, so metaverses, that kind of thing, have this potential to generate this kind of both kinds of knowledge simultaneously. So you have the ability to maybe in this world that you construct, where you can control basically everything about the world that's possible, at least in terms of the way that the world that you could design inside this virtual universe. You can control all of that, right? So you could set up experiments. You could be very, very easy to set up quite sophisticated experiments, control studies in this world by reorganizing the environment. And then at the same time, you have in this kind of UbiComp tradition of sensing, you could instrument basically everything in that world, right? Once one's in this virtual space, everything in there obviously has to go through the computer, so therefore everything can be measured. Put an asterisk next to measured, maybe. We could have an argument about that, but basically everything can be sensed. So you can kind of build this picture of reality, but you can also control it as well. And the argument the paper starts off making is that this would have a lot of potential for surveillance. That's kind of what I had when I started working on this paper. That's where I expected to end up. That was kind of be the whole paper. It's going to be a kind of critical perspective on these virtual workspaces. As time went on, I found that was, in the process of doing the research, I found that I had other questions, and I thought those other questions were perhaps a little bit more interesting. So this is the kind of start of the paper, and the conclusion is, yeah, totally. These kind of environments would massively increase the capacity for surveillance. Not much of a surprise. I thought a little more deeply about what was going on here, um, and it goes back to other stuff that I've been doing to do with the way that we measure work. Um, and I was kind of thinking about this idea that kind of the reason why when we think about work we often don't think about measurement is because modern work has been constructed around the idea of measurement. So it's not like measurement is something that has been externally imposed on work. The way that we work these days is constructed around measurement. Measurement is a core aspect of it. It's not an external kind of bolt on. How do we measure anything at work? First of all, we think about what kind of things exist or that could exist, and these are kind of ontological questions. And then how can we create knowledge about the things that exist or that could exist? And these are epistemological questions. So the first thing to think about when we're thinking about how to measure things at work is what things could exist in this context, and how could we measure them? And of course, going back to the VR example, that's pertinent, right? It's the things that exist or could exist in a virtual world are perhaps different to the things that exist or could exist in our physical reality, if you want to call it that. And the basic contention of the paper is, after talking about this rarefication and reification in terms of measurement, the paper kind of makes the argument we need to think more carefully about these kind of questions when we're thinking about what gets measured at work. So thinking about scientific management, the foundation of scientific management, which is a kind of a management theory, a way of thinking about how to organize work, make sense of work, and depending on your kind of analysis to get more out of labor or more out of capital. The basis of the management theory is measurement. This is in Fred Taylor's writings. So one of the things that he said that was necessary was to conduct a long series of experiments coupled with close observation. And this had demonstrated that when workmen of this caliber are given carefully measured tasks, it goes on to say then basically they perform better at work and they become better people. So there's quite a strong kind of moralizing, I guess, aspect to his ideas about work, in that it would improve people in all kinds of ways. This, of course, is a kind of quite a positivist epistemology, the way of, the idea is that there's real things out in the world and they're waiting to be measured. If we design the right kind of experiments, we can observe true reality. So this is the kind of basic orientation for scientific management. And its descendants. These ideas didn't stop in the 1910s. They've kind of made their way into how we construct work today. And the idea, of course, then you've got these experiments. They should be scientific. They should be driven by hypotheses. They should be controlled. So it's very much in that kind of verifying kind of tradition of abstraction or reductionism, if you want to call it that. There's different ways of different labels to put on this. Some of which are pejorative, some of which are descriptive. You can hang your own coat on whichever hook you prefer. And the question that one of the questions I explored in the paper is anyone actually doing this? Is anyone doing this kind of like systematic, controlled exploration of workplaces? Yeah, for sure, in some work contexts. But what I go on to discuss then in the paper is this idea that contemporary workplace monitoring is about instrumenting devices and applications. You get this telemetry, you feed it into these data lakes or whatever term you want to use to describe them. And then you get these kind of stochastic machines to aggregate the data and look for patterns in it. Right, so this is increasingly the way we see things happening. We get loads and loads of data, we sense everything we can, and we kind of chuck it into PyTorch and see what happens. And then the kind of the objective truth, because of course, if we're doing positivist stuff, there is reality out there, is the patterns they find. So you feed them into these machines, and the patterns the machines find, that is objective reality right there. But this is this is debatable. Does this actually is this in the tradition of Fred Taylor? Is this actually scientific? We look at things and we might critique some of these surveillance practices as being digital Taylorism or neo-Taylorism or whichever term you want to use. The idea that in some ways we're even more into scientific management now. We have these tools and technologies. one of the things I argue in the paper is that basically most employers don't have the capacity to work in this kind of way. So vertically integrated ones like Amazon might be able to. So they control the entire top to bottom chain here for the data, the hardware, the warehouses, everything. In these contexts, yeah, sure, it might be possible to conduct these kind of controlled studies in that true scientific management tradition. But what about small and medium enterprises? They're most likely to subcontract this out to a company like Microsoft, right? So the 365 suite has a whole bunch of productivity monitoring tools on it. Rather than have your in-house folk do that, you just go with Microsoft's. You take that off the shelf and you implement it, because most companies don't have the capital, they don't have the resources to have that kind of vertical integration from top to bottom in terms of collecting the data, sensing the world, analyzing it, responding to it, and then setting up experiments to test hypotheses. It's just not something most organizations have the capacity to do. They don't have the knowledge or the resources. So are there epistemological implications for this? Well, yeah, definitely. Modern work is the kind of inheritor of scientific management. It's kind of set up how we do our work today. But today's work measurement doesn't really look much like the way, it doesn't look scientific in the way that Fred Taylor would recognize. The paper then goes on to there's some even more fundamental issues. So it's kind of turtles all the way down this paper. I started off thinking it was going to be something pretty straightforward critique of VR workplaces, and I ended up somewhere completely different. If you read the paper, you can go on the adventure yourself. But I realise there's a kind of a deeper issue here about this kind of transition from these kind of controlled experimental approaches, these kind of rarefying approaches into this kind of this form of verification of kind of collecting all the data about the world. Again, whether you think that actually it's possible for these sensors to represent the world, obviously that's another question. But we've kind of transitioned away from this kind of hypothesis-driven kind of controlled approach to understanding work, to just collecting loads and loads of data, checking it through learning models, and taking what comes out. So these workplace epistemologies have changed. That's the point. It goes from the kind of actual scientific management to something else that's not really scientific management. And I make the argument in the paper that it's not scientific management at all. It's some other way of generating knowledge about work. It might have some things in common with scientific management, but it isn't scientific management. And that these ways of knowing about the workplace are tied to these machine ontologies. So what we can then find out at the workplace is tied to what a machine can know, what it can exist for a machine, or the way that a particular machine has been designed. What can exist. And so we've got these machines determining what is the truth. And this is really quite a fundamental change to what empiricism is. So Latour wrote about Boyle's air pump, and the way Latour talks about it is we go from having kind of true facts in the old world to Boyle's world, in which we have this what Latour calls a parajudicial process, where we have a few reliable people observe a phenomenon together, and then they declare what they've observed to be facts, even if they don't know its true nature, because its true nature is intractable. Maybe you can only see an epiphenomenon. You can't actually observe the true reality. You can't see the air, but you can see the effect the air has on a pump, or if you pump all the air out, you can see what effect that has. What if the witnesses now are instead of as Latour talks about empirical science, what if they go from being people to machines? And this is not as simple as, oh, now I've used a piece of technology to measure something. It means the actual the actors responsible for determining what the facts are. What if those are no longer people, but are instead machines, and we have these machine witnesses? We have a credentialing system for human scientists, for HR professionals. We trust these human witnesses to phenomena. Do we want a parajudicial process for generating objective truth where all the actors are machines? What would that look like? That sounds slightly worrying or scary. Who will credential an outsourced machine witness to the phenomenon in your workplace? Who will say, yes, this machine learning system has a PhD or has a SIPD or whatever? Who's going to do that credentialing? So AI monitoring the tools are not just a different way of observing, they're a fundamental change to what empirical observation is. So that's what the paper's about. Measurement is not a simple concept. It's not just whatever comes out of machines. Measurement's that's happening now is categorically different to measurement under scientific management, and our current critiques of workplace management must catch up. Thank you.